What I'd like to do is, since these are obviously different trials, let's start with discussing your impressions and thoughts of the Tucatinib study. That's obviously the one that's closest to changing practice. It's obviously a registrational phase 3 trial. Adam, you want to start with
So
your
no, I
thoughts
mean, I
on
think that clearly it will change practice. I think the biggest difference, I think Tucatinib and Neratinib, let's not forget about Neratinib. I think that in terms of the IC50 for the HER2 tyrosine kinase, they're about the same. I think the nice thing about Tucatinib is because it's not EGFR specific at all. I mean, the IC50 is like 5,000 or something like that. You can really jack up the dose. And I think they could have jacked up the dose in the phase 1 to the point where they really can get penetration in a lot more areas than Neratinib. I think that's the biggest difference between the HER2CLIMB trial and the NALA study, which should show a benefit as well. And they probably both have equally potent in terms of preventing, or at least preventing or probably treating brain mets, but one is a lot less toxic. And I think that because you can give that a longer time, that's probably why you saw the survival benefits with it. But clearly, it's likely going to change practice. The issue is, when is it going to be approved? And remember, this is a global, breast cancer is a global problem. And I think that while it'll probably be approved pretty quickly in the US, we'll probably be able to get it within the next 6 to 9 months, who knows around the world. So I think that, we still have Tucatinib, we have Neratinib that have likely been approved in other countries for at least extended adjuvant therapy. And I think that don't forget about those. I mean, I think that even though this likely will change the standard of care, and probably change the standard of care around the world, but it likely will be a slow process. But for me, I think that it will be one of my go-to third-line regimens when it's approved, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a game changer. I think because of the survival advantage, I think it'll be positioned in my practice right after TDM1, where I used to use capecitabine and trastuzumab. Not uncommonly there, it'll be with Tucatinib. And though the patients with brain metastases did very well, and some of them had multi-year improvements in their brain, the trial was positive for survival in the overall population. So it really is a kind of an all-comers. So I think it's going to be my go-to regimen for the right after TDM1.
But Joyce, the question I asked was that overall survival benefit driven by the brain?
Well, it turns out that
in the non-brain mets as well, but I mean, it's just
the forest plot showed everybody.
The analysis
for everybody.
that
I
they
get
showed
that.
for PFS, it definitely did. They didn't show survival specifically for the brain group yet. I suspect the
They
numbers.
did.
I don't know
What
the answer.
they
I'm just
showed
asking.
was
I'm raising
the overall survival, not in terms of what happened, the overall survival, not PFS in brain, that's going to be at a later date, but it was overall survival in people who entered the study with a history of or active brain met. And that group had improved overall survival. So, we don't actually know what the activity is in the brain, but it's certainly suggestive that it must be doing something if those people are living longer than if they got capecitabine and
How do people die
trastuzumab.
in
And
this
I think
disease?
that
How do they die? They die of brain mets usually.
well, mostly they do. I think it's going to be helpful to know what that data is, and that we'll see that soon, I think. But I think, survival, I do think is turns out to be the gold standard after all. And, and it's a pretty easy endpoint relative to PFS. So, the fact that they show survival benefit, I think is, and really interestingly, a survival benefit that's greater than the PFS benefit. It's like it really has a bigger impact, which is so interesting because I think of that as an antibody-mediated effect. So there's some interaction between trastuzumab and Tucatinib here that has to be driving that differential. I'd go with Joyce. I mean, I think a survival benefit wins, and I would go with that as next therapy. Obviously, there are people who can't tolerate capecitabine and people who won't be able to tolerate Tucatinib. I'm sure a small percentage, although I have to say the discontinuation rate was really low. So it's a great option.
Obviously.
And then we still have the trastuzumab deruxtecan, which I say differently than you do.
Traz-D.
Deruxtecan.
I like
That,
Traz-D.
TDXD actually works pretty well. So that drug, I think, is going to be really interesting because having had a patient now on it for longer than she was on TDM1 on that same phase 2 trial, I think that, it's going to be an important option for patients, and it may, although I think, lack of survival benefit, we'll probably use it next line. It's going to move up relatively quickly, so it'll be interesting to see what we find.
Right. So actually, the FDA has given trastuzumab deruxtecan a priority review, so it actually may be available soon.
I'm talking more about Tucatinib.
Right. No, I'm saying that both may be available soon, and
So
so
we're
we'll
gonna have to
I'm
figure
not
out
sure
order.
about the Tucatinib, but I think.
Yeah, right. So Tucatinib, I think.
But definitely the
soon.
Traz-D, yes.
Right. So I'm good. We've coined a new name.
Traz-D, yeah.
yeah,
It has 4 names already.
That's 4 names. Let's do it right.
But I think I think the brain met obviously is an issue. In the trastuzumab deruxtecan study, patients who had prior brain mets still had very good response rate and very good progression-free survival, but those were treated brain metastases, whereas, with HER2CLIMB there was a mix. My clinical experience is that there are two kinds of patients with HER2-positive brain mets. One are the patients who, have, a few lesions that show up, first year or two of their disease, you do SRS, and then you never hear from them again in terms of brain mets. Yeah. And then you have the patients who you treat with SRS, 6 months later they have another one, and you end up with whole brain, which you try to avoid, but yeah, it becomes, their brain becomes the, right, so their brain
That's
becomes,
how they die. They die of dementia from the
right,
whole brain RT.
Right, but there's patients in whom, but there are patients who never get brain mets, and there are patients who, the brain mets really aren't a clinical issue. And I think for those patients, my guess is I'm going to lean more towards doing trastuzumab deruxtecan because of the very high response rate and long progression-free survival. And we will have, there are 2 randomized trials that will hopefully report out relatively soon, and we can look at the that data too. So I think it's going to, as the data mature for both of the trials, it'll help us figure out how to sequence these. But the bottom line is we'll be using both drugs.
And the bottom line is we're excited about third line and beyond therapy. I mean, that's like with survivals. I mean, when would we ever think we'd be talking about?
We have a wealth of drugs.